Okay, we're starting this morning with the Let's Talk segment of our morning session. We have a question from the webinar guest, and it really tickled me because we did not coordinate this. The woman says, this is her question: when we see from many points of view, how does this expand our consciousness? Well, this is the first element that I'm going to be talking about this morning in this Sunday talk. But let me add to what I was going to say this morning, and let me repeat the question again. When we see from many points of view, how does this expand our consciousness? A real basic understanding would be this: if we only see things from the physical point of view, then we become narrow-minded. When we expand that point of view a little bit and add the emotions to it, and then add the mental to it, or our intelligence level to it, then gradually, our understanding begins to encompass more ideas, more concepts. The downside of that is that if we're not resourcing or accessing true information, then the false information mixes with our personal opinions, and we still become narrow-minded. So the ultimate goal for spiritual people, particularly, are those that want to expand their points of view in such a way that they become intuitive. In becoming intuitive, then we're able to see the cause, of a particular situation. There's also a word that comes to mind. People who have many points of view are able to synthesize those points of view in such a way that it reflects the cause of any situation. Okay. Any other questions?
A couple of weeks ago, you were talking about how we leave behind the astral corpse and the mental corpse. And the question is, can we engage in any kind of visualization to get rid of them or burn them away?
Okay. I'm so glad you asked the question. 2 weeks ago, at the end of the talk, the Sunday talk, I kind of gave a piece of information out that's not normally known. And in that process, we began talking about astral and mental corpses. It's a very, very heavy subject. You really need to be an esoteric student, one who thinks beyond the physical. We'll take Doreen's question from this morning and expand our consciousness to think more beyond the physical and begin to think more about what occurs with life as we move into the subtle planes. But again, this is not for the faint-hearted. Truly, it is not. The first thing to realize that most astral corpses are found in the lower or middle part of the astral world. So most astral corpses are found in the lower or the middle strata of the astral world. Mental corpses, it's pretty rare to find mental corpses. I am going to answer your question in a minute, Catherine. I want to give some background. Like a question would be, how how do we have astral corpses, and how do astral corpses affect those who are still alive? And they do. Astral corpses can affect people who are alive and walking on the planet. What happens is that as the person begins to live a more degenerative kind of life, their morals are poor. Spiritually, they are no longer following the rules of the road, considering light and love and beauty and goodness and joy and freedom. This is the beginning of a process of degeneration. The degeneration is a process that affects our subtle centers. Now, these subtle centers, you have to know what these centers are. Like the base of the spine, the sacral center, the solar plexus, the heart, the throat, the pineal, and the head center, and their sub-centers. When we begin to live a life of degeneration, which would include drugs and alcohol and sexual diseases and slander and hatred, the practice of slander and hatred, these are all activities that we have the freedom to engage in, as human beings, but it takes a heavy toll on our soul. And that's the process of degeneration, where it affects the subtle bodies. These subtle bodies affect certain glands and organs and cells and atoms in our body. And you begin to see a decaying or a degenerating process. Now, you can stop it. This is the answer to her question. You can stop this, and I want to use the word intense. By intense aspiration, by intense labor, by intense dedication, by dedicating your life to something outside of yourself in a very selfless manner. But the key word here is intensity, the intensity of it. It's not a weekend experience or thinking, okay, I'm going to go to church and that will every Sunday morning, and by going to church every Sunday morning, now I'll be forgiven of every damn thing, that I've ever done, to work against the unfolding process of my soul, and I'll go to heaven right straight from here to there. That's just not what the teaching tells us. It does not work that way. It's the first step toward regeneration. Now, if you want to get into the more heavier side, when we begin to live a life that goes against evolution, that goes against the progress of our unfolding human soul, and our subtle centers begin to degenerate, we carry this degeneration from one life into another, into another, into another, which means we take diseases from one life into the next, into the next, into the next. But it's not always necessarily the same disease. It can be a different disease, which I find a bit perplexing until you learn about the process of certain diseases that occur with society. Okay, so if you're carrying forward these degenerative, subtle centers from one life to the next, to the next, to the next, It's telling us we have weaknesses in these bodies, and the result of the weaknesses in these bodies make us prone to diseases that are prevalent in today's society. So we pick them up. This is also why babies are born with certain diseases. Sometimes they call them genetic. Well, that's not so far fetched from the teaching, because this would be the genetics of our unfolding human soul. And then another way to stop it is if we are sacrificial and we live a highly aspirational life. What inspires somebody to do that? You know, I've thought that's a question I've thought a lot about in terms of trying to find an answer. I think the way a person makes a decision to live a highly aspirational life is they are now in touch with their inner guidance. They're in touch with the teaching, or that they're responsive to the impulse of their soul. And they'll come into a life that is designed and has a pattern that will present opportunities to them to live that aspirational life. Or during the process of their lifetime, they have a critical event that occurs in their life, and that critical event is an awakening experience, and the result of the awakening experience, their whole life changes, and they become very aspirational. Another way is to understand is that if you indeed have carried in and are influenced by your previous astral or mental corpses, and you live a life of sacrifice and aspiration and dedication and devotion and so forth, when you pass, when you die in this incarnation, you're going to go through the astral plane and on into the mental plane. And as you move through the astral plane, you burn up that astral corpse. And the process of the burning, it means that you are burning any recordings that are left in that astral corpse. I don't even want to get into talking about mental corpses this morning, or I'll never get to the Sunday talk. Do you want more? I can't see any raised hands on that, on the webinar. If you have the eyes to see, if you have the ability to function consciously on the astral plane, you are going to see these astral corpses, and you're going to see how entities in the astral plane and other entities use these corpses. If it is an entity or a member of the Dark Lodge, they have the knowledge to use that astral corpse in various ways. They will turn on the recording, or they will create a recording and put it in that astral corpse. And because you are related to that astral corpse, it feeds you, it nurtures you, and you then live your life according to the recording of that astral corpse. Another piece of information, the teaching tells us don't be attached to anything or anybody, right? Well, that's very difficult to do because we are so human. So we fall in love and we take that love to the nth degree to where, what is the phrase, you're joined at the hip? Okay, let's say that person dies. What happens is when they die, they'll go to the astral plane, they will connect with your astral center, and you'll hear people say, you know, I feel my loved one is with me. I feel like every day they're right there with me. It's the influence of their astral body, your astral body and their corpse that are in contact with one another. It's very interesting. The same with animals. You know, animals don't know the difference between their physical world and their astral world. When they die, they see your astral body, they think it's still you. And if you are not in control, if you have not yet mastered your astral body, then your pets, your beloved pets, will be right there with you. All of them. Since we tend to lose a pet and buy another, you know how that goes. So that's pretty heavy stuff. Okay. Okay, I think I'm going to end there. I don't want to, bum anyone out, but but it's just fact. It's the way it is, and it can sound fictional until you're on that astral plane. When you withdraw your consciousness from your physical etheric body and walk out onto the astral plane, and you have the vision, the senses to understand what you are seeing, and you can recognize it, then you know that this is fact. This is reality. So the teaching assumes that we don't all yet have that ability, so it teaches us, and then all this education is a process to underlie why we're told to live life in a certain way. And if we don't live it in a certain way, then we encounter problems from one life to another, to another, to another. We just drag it through, these series of lifetimes until at one point we decide that enough's enough, and we change our lifestyle. Okay. So we've covered in our Let's Talk this morning the importance of having many points of view and how it expands our consciousness, and then more about the astral corpse. Maybe someday we'll talk about mental corpses. Let me say one more thing. Trying to answer a question about, what do we do if we have an astral corpse? Every once in a while, you're going to find a disciple that has remnants of the astral corpse they leave behind, or even the mental corpse, for various reasons. What's so beautiful is that if you are in contact with a great teacher, is that teacher will burn your astral corpse for you, or will burn your mental corpse for you, because you are deserving of it. So that's the good news. Okay. Okay, so this morning I'm going to talk about the ego versus the soul. Our great teachers, in presenting the ageless wisdom to us, encourage us to approach the teaching from various points of view. See how this ties in with the question from the webinar person? I get so excited when something like that happens, because it talks about, it's a sign, it's indication of the group mind. Someone is in tune, is aligned with the group mind. It's so beautiful. Anyway, so why does the teaching encourage us to approach it from different points of view? It is so we don't fall into the trap of dogma or doctrine or sameness. The teaching provides our spiritual education, helping us to have an opportunity to expand our consciousness. If we take one definition and take that only one definition and apply it to the various points of view that are presented to us from the teaching, it's going to lead us into a state of confusion, and that state of confusion can ultimately cause us to distort the teaching. The next thing is, if you are to learn, you must remember what you study. If you don't remember what you are studying, you're not going to learn. So you can have 1,000 books on your bookshelf, and you can have read all thousands of those books. But if you don't remember what you have studied, you're not going to learn. It's as simple as that. So early on in your studies, whether you are reading Agni Yoga or the teachings of the Tibetan or the writings of H.P. Blavatsky, there are certain terms that you must remember. And there are various definitions, or you're going to put yourself on the wrong track of understanding. For example, we have the word soul with the lowercase s, soul. And then we have the word soul with an uppercase, a capital S, soul. So the lowercase soul and the uppercase soul, we have to know the difference between the two. The lowercase soul is indicative of the unfolding human soul, most especially when you study Torquem Saradarian's writings. He has taken the teachings of the Tibetan and he has made it easier for us to understand. For when you read the Tibetan's teachings, the writings of Alice Bailey, the Tibetan leaves us to understand or to decide if the teaching is referencing the unfolding human soul or the higher self. Now here's another term. The higher self also corresponds with a capital S, soul. So when you're reading the Tibetan's teachings, you need to know when you're reading that lowercase s, soul, you have to have enough studying, enough understanding to recognize, is the Tibetan talking to you about the unfolding human soul or the capital S soul, your higher self, and the soul-infused personality. Next, when you read the term ego, written with a lowercase e, you know the human soul is there. Little e, ego. You know that the human soul is there, but it's mixed with mud. Okay, this is ego with a little e. When you read the word ego with the capital E, then you learn that in your studies, it's referencing the higher self. If you don't know this, you're going to distort the teaching, and you're going to confuse yourself, and you're going to be engaged in arguments with people and saying, no, 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 you don't know what that means. So be really careful and study carefully and learn from what you are studying and remember what you are studying, so we don't distort the meaning of the teaching. The interpretation when reading about the higher self is to know the higher self is the higher octave of our consciousness. The consciousness of the higher self, the capital S soul, functions on the higher mental plane. Today, I'm talking about the lower case e, ego, and the lowercase s, soul. Ego, or little ego, is the result of identification of the human soul with the negative states of his vehicles. I'm going to repeat this because it will help you so much as you understand yourself and you understand the teaching and why the teaching says we must evolve, we must progress, we must purify ourselves. This is why. Ego is the result of identification of the human soul with the negative states of his vehicles, the negative states of the personality. We also call the point of identification a human entity. Wherever the ego and the soul is identified, it becomes a human entity. In Torkim's writings, he calls it the awareness unit. The awareness unit. The teaching in general calls it a human identity. So we take the ego and the human soul, identifying with the negative parts of our physical, emotional, mental bodies. And that's where we become a human entity, or our awareness unit. That's where it functions. When this consciousness, this level of consciousness identifies with the physical vehicle, he builds an ego there. This is why you have people that are so focused on bulking up their physical body. They have muscles, they can raise weights beyond imagination. That's their ego. That's where their ego is identified. Their ego is there. When this consciousness identifies with glamours of the emotional body, he builds an ego there. When he identifies with mental illusions and negative thought forms, he builds an ego on the mental level. Now, eventually he disidentifies from these levels and uses them instead of this identification using us as an ego. Now we turn the table, so to speak, and use it instead. For example, you have a feeling. See, but you're not that feeling. You have a thought, but you are not that thought. You have a plan, but you are not that plan. You are emancipating yourself, and you are going to the level of the true self, the one self. First, your ego is built when you identify with your blind physical urges and drives. I tell you, you need to get this talk and listen and make notes and think about it, and then begin to observe your life to see, do you still have an ego? And where is it controlling you? So the ego is first built when you identify with your blind urges and drives. When this occurs, your soul becomes mixed with the substance of your personality life. The three vehicles. The human soul is there, but it is conquered by the matter with which it is identified. So let's say that your physical body is a soil and your spirit mixes with it, and now you have an ego, a human identity. You are not your pure self. You are mixed with your physical blind urges and drives. One day, a person on impulse decided she was going to try to instill fear in a family member by telling that older person, I can physically hurt you anytime I want. And she lifted her fist to demonstrate her strength to a person 25 years her senior. That is a blind urge, see, or drive. She was out of control. See, do you see? The ego is built when you identify with your blind urges and drives. It's by impulse. You can be unified with your negative thought forms. For example, fanaticism. Fanaticism is a pure demonstration of egotism. You are mixed with your limited ideas, plans, and thoughts. You are not someone who can look at these and use them. Wherever you are identified, there is where you become an ego. The highest teaching of Buddha was detachment. This does not refer to detachment from your personal belongings and friends, but detachment from those elements and substances that are sucking you into themselves and causing you to lose your identity. See this astral corpse, how it's tied in here? Detachment from those elements and substances, the astral and mental corpses, that are sucking you into themselves and causing you to lose your identity and your real individuality. So you must think carefully about these things, because it is so important to our unfolding human soul, to our progress. Ask yourself what has caused you to lose your identity. I know this question may offend your sense of self-importance, but especially if it has offended you, you need to ask yourself this question more than ever. Let us say that you suddenly have a sex urge. In such an instance, you are united with your urge, and it is controlling you. You are not controlling it. We fall into such situations many times, and when we fall, we know that we have lost ourselves. It is fine to enjoy things, but without identification. That is the difficult aspect. When we are identified with the negative states of our physical, emotional, and mental bodies or nature, we build an ego on that level. You can be so elastic that you cycle yourself in these three egos simultaneously. The egos of your physical, emotional, and mental vehicles. You can realize all of this by observing yourself. For example, fanaticism or dogmatism are identifications with your mental hallucinations. You suddenly think that whatever you know, that is all there is to know. What will help you is to approach the teaching from various points of view, so you don't fall into the trap of dogma and doctrine and sameness of thinking that whatever you know, that is all there is to know. Let me reiterate, fanaticism and dogmatism is identification with your mental hallucinations. When you are identified with your desires, your emotions, you lose your true self and become the ego. Our purpose, and the purpose of our spiritual education, is to free ourselves from this jungle to the degree that we can. Spiritual progress is not only reading books, writing books, and teaching from books while thinking we are an initiate, saved and savaged. Right. Spiritual progress is to detach and separate ourselves from identification with our threefold nature so we can be our true self. This is the whole foundation of the teaching of Christ and Buddha and Krishna. For example, in the Upanishads it says, quote, "You are the sword, and you must pull yourself out from the sheath which holds it," unquote. Learn not to identify with your blind urges and drives. Learn not to identify with your desires, with your hatred and fear and anger and jealousy and revenge and inclination towards slander. When you learn not to identify your thoughts and your opinions and your knowledge, then you're going to be a super person. When you learn not to identify with them. It is easy to say this, but when you start practicing these concepts, you are going to see how difficult it is. But the degree to which we conquer these identifications is the degree of our spiritual achievement. That spiritual achievement is called self-actualization. Self-actualization is a process in which on every level of our being, we are the victor, the controller, the master. This is the real science of our spirit. If we can do this, we will find the path of our real spiritual growth. This is not religious growth, it is spiritual growth. Spiritual growth means an ever advancing urge within you to strive and to reach that vision that you have. This is spirituality. Spirituality is not a church, it's not a mosque, it's not a temple, and so forth. Spirituality is the process of finding your independence and freedom from these things. This is found only if you emancipate yourself from these things which imprison you. We are prisoners of our hatred, of our jealousy. Underlying all hatred, all jealousy is self-interest. And below the foundation of self-interest is what? It's that ugly ego. Yeah. In the future, people would develop these seeds, these ideas of spiritual progress, and become the leaders of humanity. They will lead humanity not in the interests of this or that nation or a special interest for so-called peace. They will lead people in the interest of peace for all humanity. Only in a free humanity will you be free. Only in a free humanity will you be free. The ego is built when dark forces obsess or possess you through your desires and urges and drives, and your thought forms that are based on fear and anger and hatred and jealousy and self-interest and treason. For example, you make plans to take out your revenge on someone who you feel has offended you. Thinking about taking revenge creates a form. Thinking about taking revenge creates a form. Clairvoyance can see these thought forms. A revengeful dark force enters into this thought form, and at that point, you have someone in your aura. That entity will force you to be very revengeful. It's like, gosh, we are so out of time. I cannot believe it, and I have so much more to share. So I may just go ahead and share it. But I was thinking, the first time I was exposed to this, it was so shocking. I went into a bar with my husband, and it was at that time I was opening up spiritually, and I didn't want to be in there. I was really uncomfortable. I was, not that I'm a teetotaler, I wasn't then, but something made me really uncomfortable, and all of a sudden I began to see people sitting at the bar, and there were entities that were hunched over the living person, and what they were doing was sucking the enjoyment of the desire of that person that was drinking into their own body, their own astral body. They don't get drunk. Astral entities do not get drunk because they don't have the physical body, but they are still addicted to the alcohol. So they're hunching over. I mean, you can imagine the shock. I mean, I ran, I could not believe what I was seeing. It's horrifying. So this is why the teaching says, don't drink. And if you're going to drink, cut your drink half in water and drink it before dusk, before it gets dark. Okay? Dark. I know. It's okay to have a little sip of this or a little sip of that. But if you are on a spiritual path and you're trying to release your unfolding human soul from its addictions and all of the things that we know, that bombard us, then don't drink. And this is why. The minute you see an astral entity sucking somebody dry because of their desire, believe me, you're not going to drink ever again. So regardless, that dark entity will obsess and possess you. This is how the ego is formed. When this happens, a danger exists because you have two command centers within you. One is you, and one is your ego that is occupied by an entity working against your spiritual interests. This is a very difficult case because often you act as a double person. Split personality. Oh, there's so much I could say. It's driving me crazy. We gradually identify with the obsessor through our urges and drives, through our glamours and desires and thought forms and plans and self-interest. It is very difficult to destroy our ego because it dwells in and is occupied by an entity who continuously tries not to lose his position. He controls you by leading you into vanity. Please know that if you or someone you know falls into that degree of egoism, there is not too much one can do to release them. Until someday you decide, I don't like who I am and what is controlling me, and you go to somebody and say, tell me how to help myself, and you're ready to be helped. It's very difficult. Even going to that somebody and says, please, please help me, get rid of this stuff. That ego is so strong, you'll sit there critically listening to the person that's willing to help you, critically listening to that person who is so generously willing to help you, and you attack that person. It's the ego that's attacking that entity, that's attacking that one that's trying to help you. So also know that you can have urges and drives and desires, but only as long as you are not identified with them. You see the freedom that we have here? We can have these things. Don't be identified with them. In this kind of situation, you can eventually annihilate them or put them in the right place and use them in the right dosage. The ego is also formed by parents and grandparents and teachers when they praise and flatter you. They impress upon you certain images that you must try to be, but for which you have no preparation. This is very prevalent in older cultures. For example, they say, my son, you are going to be a hero in the future. You are going to be a great lawyer. You are so beautiful. You are better than others. What happens to these children? They puff up and have big egos. I've seen this with many children, young children, and children who are now adults as well. Sometimes we flatter people by saying, you are a great writer, a philosophy, you are a great husband, even if none of these things are true. So don't say such things if they are not true. You must understand what flattery is. When someone gives a wonderful lecture or writes a good book, don't tell them, I'm not flattering, but you did a good job with that lecture. Well, first of all, and for heaven's sakes, if you are not an authority on writing or speaking, don't tell them that you did a good job. Who are you to present yourself as an authority if you've never lectured? You can show your appreciation to the speaker or the author by telling that person how their book or lecture spoke to you, how it made you think about this or that, or just say simply thank you. The ego is built through flattery. For example, we are all saved. We are all saved. I got saved. I've been saved several times, actually. When Jesus appears, they tell us, we will be right there with him. Is this really true? Come to your senses. Some groups are told by their leaders, we are a superior race. Each of you is different and superior to other people. This creates a glamour, an illusion, an ego, and you carry it from one life to another to another. People are told repeatedly that they are superhuman beings, but they see that they are doing many obnoxious things. But because of the superiority glamour, glasses cover their eyes. They always see themselves as super, but do the most terrible acts. At that point, they become a split personality. A split personality is a failure. They cannot achieve anything. One side says, I'm going to do it, and the other side says, you stupid, you can't do it. That person is stuck between the two, and I'm almost done. Almost done. Do not flatter yourself and become a swollen-headed person. Failure starts when you believe that you are something when you are not exactly what you think you are. Another way the ego is built is by feeling inferior. Inferiority causes jealousy. When you feel that you are inferior, you start building artificial images about yourself in order to feel that you are great. You are building an ego. This is another trap, and it's so complex. So, sometimes when you meditate, do a self-examination. Sometimes ask yourself, or set aside a portion of the day so that you can analyze these questions. You can ask yourself, why did I do this? Oh, it was because I was feeling inferior. Why did jealousy come? Well, jealousy is an urge to show others by hurting them that you are superior when actually you are inferior. In summary, creating an ego is a technique of dark forces to stop the evolution of our unfolding human soul and to make it serve separative interests against the tendency of our human soul. And the tendency of our human soul is unity, harmony, working for great causes, freedom, and cooperation. The ego is created by the elementals and the forces that control these elementals, plus forces that are on the involutionary arc. That's ego. So now you know the difference between little e, ego, capital E, ego, little s, soul, capital S, soul, although we didn't talk much about that. Thank you for letting me carry on this morning. I just am so focused on the importance of learning these things.